It was a grey morning, in which the sun seemed to hide behind the heavy clouds, as if it did not wish to witness the weight of the decision that an 18-year-old girl would be forced to make. She was a young woman of rare beauty, with delicate features and a body marked by the purity of youth, but with sad eyes that already reflected a lifetime of sacrifices. Raised in poverty, she had always known that her family had little to offer beyond simple and genuine love. But in that moment, not even that love seemed enough to prevent the world from collapsing upon them. Her father, a hard-working man who had always provided for the household with dignity, now withered in bed, breathing with difficulty, consumed by the relentless advance of lung cancer. With every cough, with every moan of pain, the girl felt her heart shatter, and it was as though death already hovered over the fragile home that barely stood upright. Her mother, consumed by despair, spent sleepless nights holding her husband's hands and crying in silence, not knowing how to pay for even the most basic medicines, much less the expensive treatment that could offer a fragment of hope. It was in that abyss of pain that the girl realized she had no choice, for her life no longer belonged to her. It belonged to her father's survival, to her mother's desperate need, and to the crushing weight of misery. Thus, she made the most difficult and bitter decision any woman could ever make: to sell what she had most sacred, what symbolized her innocence, her virginity, that which she had always believed to be the most precious gift for someone she truly loved, now became a bargaining chip in the name of sacrifice. The proposal arose almost as a whisper, like an indecent secret that should never be spoken aloud. There were rumors that a millionaire, a man rich beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals, was seeking a young woman to satisfy a dark whim. He was 60 years old, yet carried the body of a gladiator, muscular, vigorous, displaying his strength with arrogance. However, along with the sculpted body came a heart hardened by resentment, bitterness, and a lifetime of pride and cruelty. He was a man feared, hated by many, yet desired by women who saw in him only the sparkle of wealth. And now, this man who had never known limits would become the buyer of something the girl had never imagined selling: her purity. That night, when she accepted the deal, she felt a part of herself die. She did not cry in front of her mother. She did not let her father know, for his pride would never allow it. But she locked herself in her room and let the tears slide silently down her face. Each drop that touched her skin was like a piece of her soul detaching, announcing that the sweet and innocent girl would turn into something she never wanted to be. And even so, there was a flame inside her that screamed she was doing the right thing, because every pain she felt would be small compared to the possibility of saving the man who had taught her everything about courage, dignity, and love. The deal was sealed in silence, with cold papers and dry words. The girl would sell her virginity to the millionaire, and in exchange she would receive an amount capable of paying for her father's treatment. But it was not just a transaction. It was the beginning of a story of pain and redemption, of humiliation and hope, of a cruel destiny that would unite two opposite worlds. On one side, the sacrificed purity of a girl who knew only the simple life. On the other, the coldness of a man accustomed to buying everything he desired, never believing in the power of love. At that instant, as she walked with her head lowered to seal the fate that would change her life forever, she still did not know that, between tears and sacrifices, true love would be born out of pain, transforming not only her own heart, but also the hardened heart of a man who no longer believed in redemption. The room where everything would take place seemed as though it had come from another world. Cold marble on the floor, chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, reflecting an almost arrogant light, noble wooden furniture exuding power and luxury. For the 18-year-old girl, accustomed to the smell of a modest home, to the warmth of the lit kitchen, and the noise of the poor street where she had grown up, that environment was suffocating, as if every detail screamed that she did not belong there. With trembling hands, lowered eyes, and a racing heart, she awaited his arrival, the man who would forever change the course of her life. When he finally entered, the millionaire dominated the space with his presence. It was not only his imposing height or the muscular body that, even at 60 years old, shamed much younger men. It was the aura of power, the expression steeped in pride, the posture of someone accustomed to commanding and never being contradicted. He entered shirtless, displaying a physique carved by years of discipline, But what stood out most was not his mature, virile beauty, but rather his cold, calculating gaze, the look of a man who saw everything as property. His eyes scanned the young girl with the same indifference with which he would evaluate luxury cars or works of art. On the table lay the papers of the contract, words written in legal terms, clauses that described her life as if she were a product. He made it clear from the very beginning that he was not only buying a night, but imposing rules to dominate every aspect of the young woman. He said she would live under his roof, obey his orders, never disobey him, and be reminded every day that she was nothing more than purchased merchandise. The tone of his voice was sharp, and with every word, the girl felt her heart tighten even more, as if life itself were being torn away without mercy. She tried to argue in silence, but there was no room for negotiation. The millionaire did not tolerate weakness, did not admit questioning. With a cruel smile, he signed his part of the contract in front of her, as though buying a rare object at an auction. Then he pushed the papers toward her, and the weight of the pen in her hands felt heavier than fate itself. Trembling, with tears restrained in her eyes, she signed, knowing that each letter written was the surrender of her freedom, the sealing of her purity in exchange for her father's survival. He observed her with a mixture of arrogance and disdain. There was no compassion in his expression, only the pride of someone who considered himself victorious, capable of bending innocent youth to his will. In the end, he stored the documents in a leather folder, as if they were just another investment among so many he possessed. For him, that contract was nothing more than another business deal. But for her, it was the sentence of a life scarred by sacrifice. The young woman felt the weight of humiliation. There was no romance, no warmth, not even a trace of respect. There was only a cruel contract, a transaction that transformed her into the possession of a proud and hardened man. Even so, she took a deep breath and raised her tearful eyes, reminding herself of the reason she had accepted it all: to save her father. At that moment, she swore to herself that she would endure every humiliation, every cold glance, every gesture of contempt, if it meant seeing the man who had given her life smile once again. And so, the contract was sealed. It was not only paper and ink. It was the beginning of a coexistence marked by pain, confrontation, pride, and passion hidden between the lines. The cruel contract not only bound her to him, but also ignited a story that would test the limits of the human heart, showing that even the heaviest chains could be broken by the unexpected power of love. The room where she was taken seemed like a luxurious temple built only to display power and wealth. The walls were covered with heavy velvet curtains. The enormous bed looked like a throne, and every detail exuded an opulence the young girl had never even dreamed of touching. Yet, for her, there was no beauty in that place. Everything seemed threatening, suffocating, as if every object were a witness to the greatest humiliation she was about to endure. Her steps trembled, her heart pounded like a drum, and fear mixed with a pain that did not come from the body, but from the soul. She knew there was no turning back. Her innocence, her dream of giving her first kiss, her first touch, her first surrender to someone she truly loved would be stolen that night, not by choice, but by necessity. The millionaire entered the room without haste, like someone who knew how to dominate every second. He was shirtless, displaying the muscular body that, even at 60 years old, remained imposing. His eyes, however, were more intense than his muscles, cold, domineering, incapable of offering any comfort. He looked at her as a hunter looks at his prey, not as a man looks at a woman. The young girl, curled up before him, clutched the sheets as if they were her only protection. The silence that fell was so heavy it seemed to crush the air, and when he finally approached, her heart almost leapt out of her chest. He spoke little, but each word was like a blade. He said he would not accept tears, that he wanted no weakness, that she should remember she now belonged to him. His authoritarian tone made him even more cruel, and the girl, with tears restrained in her eyes, felt her soul begging for an embrace that would never come. Her body trembled, not from desire, but from fear, and even so, there was within her a firm voice reminding her of the reason: her father, his life, the hope of seeing him survive. It was that memory that gave her the strength to remain steady, even when everything inside her screamed to run away. The The first approach was brutal in its intensity, yet paradoxical in its effect. The millionaire, accustomed to domination, expected desperate resistance, cries, or despair. Instead, he found only silent tears and a submission that came not only from fear, but from courage. She did not fight against him because she was already fighting against life, against pain, against an unjust destiny, and that disarmed him for a moment. Even if he would never admit it, even if he hid it behind pride and power, something in him faltered when he perceived the purity of that young woman. The clash between the two worlds happened on that bed. On one side, a man hardened by resentments and vanities, burdened by the cruelties he had committed throughout his life. On the other, an innocent young woman, offering her first time not out of desire or ambition, but out of love for her parents. The night was long, marked by stifled tears, by domineering gestures, but also by an unexpected silence that revealed the first crack in the wall he had built around his own heart. When it was over, she remained lying on her side, her gaze lost and her eyes brimming with tears. The millionaire, in turn, observed her in silence, trying to decipher what he had felt. For the first time in years, it was not only physical pleasure or satisfied vanity. There was something more, something that unsettled him because he could not explain it. Perhaps it was the way she endured everything without breaking. Perhaps it was the purity he had not been able to completely destroy. That night, amid the suffocating luxury and the silent pain, the beginning of a tortuous story was born, marked by suffering and sacrifice, but also by the first breath of humanity in a heart too hardened to believe in love. The following days felt like a deep dive into a frozen, dark ocean. The young woman, still marked by the pain of that first night, tried to adapt to life inside the mansion, but every corner of that house seemed to remind her that it was not her home, but a golden prison. The millionaire, proud and domineering, made a point of reminding her at every moment that she was not there for love, but for a contract. His gaze was sharp, his tone of voice dripped with contempt, and every word seemed to be used to belittle her, as if the very fact of having bought her was a trophy for his arrogance. He roamed the mansion like a king without a crown, always showing off his muscular body, shirtless, as though his physique were living proof of his superiority, a constant challenge to the passing of time. He prided himself on still arousing envy in younger men and desire in women who approached him only out of interest. Yet despite all this pride, there was something in him that made him bitter. He did not smile sincerely, he did not know tenderness, and he turned every simple gesture into a display of power. For him, the world was a battlefield, where everyone had to bow to his will. The young woman, though frightened, never stopped observing. She noticed how he treated the servants with coldness, as if they were disposable pieces, how he dealt with his business partners, always imposing his dominance, and even with his distant family, who avoided contact, weary of his arrogance and his closed heart. He had become a man feared, isolated in his wealth, incapable of trusting anyone. Pride and resentment were his weapons, and he wielded them against all. One night, during a solitary dinner, in a room lit by candelabras, he looked at her with a severe gaze and told her she should never forget the reason she was there. He said innocence did not buy medicine, purity did not pay hospitals, and that she had only found a path in life because he, with all his power and money, had given her this opportunity. His words were cruel, like knives thrown against her chest. Even so, she swallowed her tears, reminding herself that every humiliation was the price for her father's treatment. Yet at the same time, an unexpected spark began to emerge. Behind that mask of coldness, she noticed almost invisible cracks. When he thought no one was watching, his eyes drifted into emptiness, revealing a tormented man. In rare moments, he seemed tired of his own pride, as if his hardness were also his prison. But the moment he realized someone was looking, he quickly lifted his chin, recovered his cruel tone, and returned to being the proud man everyone feared. For the young woman, it was impossible not to feel fear and pain in the face of his cruelty. But it was also impossible not to notice that behind all those walls of resentment, there was a hidden heart, wounded and unable to surrender. A heart that, despite its denial, had already begun to beat differently since the night it first encountered her innocence. When the young woman was finally able to visit her parents again, it felt as though she were crossing between two completely opposite worlds. She left the mansion filled with luxury, silence, and arrogance to return to the humble little house where she had grown up, built of peeling walls and old furniture that survived more through the strength of hope than solidity. There, every corner carried memories of childhood, and the smell of simple coffee in the kitchen, mixed with the odor of cheap medicine that was no longer enough to hold back her father's illness. The contrast was cruel. On one side, the suffocating shine of money. On the other, the fragility of real life, sustained only by the love of a family. Her father was increasingly frail, lying in a small bed, breathing with difficulty. His chest rose and fell in an irregular rhythm, and the dry, painful cough was like a dagger to every heart that heard it. The young woman knelt beside him and held his hand, feeling the fragile warmth of someone already fighting against death. He smiled, even with effort, and tried to comfort her, as if she were the one in need of consolation. He told her not to worry, that one day everything would be fine, never imagining the sacrifices his daughter had made in silence to buy a little more time for his life. The mother, with a face marked by sleepless nights, embraced her daughter and cried silently. She asked where the money was coming from that, miraculously, was beginning to pay for the first exams and treatments. The young woman averted her eyes, inventing vague explanations, unable to reveal the bitter truth she carried inside her heart. How could she tell that simple woman that her daughter had sold what was most pure? How could she confess that her body had become a currency of exchange? The lie weighed on her like a cross, but it was the only way to protect her parents from unbearable pain. Even amid tears and anguish, there was love. The young woman helped her mother prepare teas, organized the medicine, adjusted her father's pillows, and felt that each small gesture gave her back a piece of the strength she had lost in the mansion. It was there, in that poor and fragile home, that she still found the essence of life: affection, timid laughter, quiet conversations so as not to disturb the sick man. At her parents' side, she felt once again like the innocent girl who once ran through the yard, and for a few moments, she could forget the golden prison in which she now lived. Yet reality did not allow her to dream for long. The money that arrived was the constant reminder of the pact she had sealed with the proud millionaire. Every medicine bought, every exam performed, every slightly eased breath from her father was paid for with the price of her soul. And even so, she did not regret it. She knew she would endure the pain 1,000 times over if it meant seeing her father smile, even for the briefest moments. As she returned to the mansion, with tearful eyes and a heart divided between love and sacrifice, the young woman realized she was trapped in an impossible dilemma. She lived between the pure affection of her family and the cruelty of the man who had bought her. Two worlds that should never have crossed, but were now bound together by the invisible thread of destiny. And within her, a new feeling began to emerge. Not for the luxury, not for the humiliation, but for the strange crack she had perceived in the millionaire's heart. A crack that somehow seemed to carry the promise that not even the worst prison could silence the power of love. Upon returning to the mansion after visiting her parents, the young woman was once again plunged into a universe that seemed never to have been made for her. Each corridor gleamed with polished floors that reflected her image like a cruel mirror. Each painting on the walls displayed works worth more than her entire home, and every detail of the decoration seemed to scream that she was nothing more than an intruder in that world of excess. The millionaire made a point of reinforcing that distance, reminding her in small gestures and words that she was only there because he had bought her purity. Luxury, which for many could have been a dream, for her was a prison where beauty turned into humiliation. The servants of the house, accustomed to their master's coldness, looked at her with curiosity, and in some cases, with veiled contempt. Some whispered in the corridors, murmuring that the girl was nothing more than another adventure for the millionaire. Others watched her with pity, aware that she was just another piece in the cruel game he enjoyed controlling. The young woman, proud in her essence, pretended not to hear, but each word cut her like a blade, reinforcing her sense of not belonging. The millionaire, meanwhile, seemed to enjoy the situation. He took her to refined dinners, not out of affection, but to exhibit her as a trophy. He delighted in observing society's shocked stares when the young girl, so youthful and innocent, walked at his side. She was beautiful like a princess from a fairy tale, but the glaring age difference and the whispered rumors circulating through the halls of luxury turned the relationship into a scandal. The wealthy women cast judgmental looks, while the men laughed quietly, believing she was just another one in search of fortune. At these events, the millionaire treated her with calculated coldness. He offered no gestures of tenderness, did not hold her hand with care, did not speak words of affection. On the contrary, he liked to reinforce in public that she was there because he had chosen her, because he had the power to buy whatever he wanted, even the innocence of a young woman. For him, it was a demonstration of superiority. For her, it was constant humiliation. Each night at luxurious parties became a spectacle of silent pain, where her soul screamed while her face remained firm, hiding the tears. Inside the mansion, the humiliations continued in small but devastating details. He decided what she would wear, what words she should speak before his guests, how she should carry herself. He treated her as if she were part of his collection of conquests. Yet, despite the harshness, there were fleeting moments when he seemed unsettled, when he found her crying alone, or when he noticed how she still carried purity in her eyes even after everything. He fell silent, unable to sustain his cruelty for long minutes. Still, he quickly returned to the role of the proud man, as though admitting weakness was the worst of defeats. For the young woman, each day was a battle between the pain of humiliation and the strength she found in remembering the reason for her presence there. Her father, still in treatment, receiving medicine that now gave him a new chance at life. Luxury did not dazzle her. Expensive dresses did not console her. Jewels did not bring her any brightness. What sustained her was the memory of her humble home, of her father's fragile hand holding hers, of her mother's faith in better days. It was that which gave her the strength to endure every humiliation, every look of contempt, every cruel word. And without realizing it, the millionaire began to observe that resilience. With every gesture of hers, every silence, every hidden tear, he realized that the young woman was not like the other women who had passed through his life. She was not there for vanity, did not seek luxury, did not beg for expensive gifts. She endured because there was something greater within her. And even if he did not admit it, that truth began to disturb him, cracking, even if slowly, the armor of pride he had built throughout his life. As the days went by, the young woman began to observe every detail of the millionaire's life, as if she wanted to understand where so much harshness, so much resentment, so much pleasure in humiliating others came from. In the mansion, there was no room for sincere smiles. The servants obeyed in silence, afraid of contradicting him. His business partners spoke with caution, always fearful of provoking his fury. Even those who approached out of interest kept their distance, for they knew that man offered no affection, only power. It was as if his wealth were a wall that pushed everyone away, and he, hidden behind it, reigned alone on a cold throne. The young woman noticed that every gesture of his was calculated. When giving orders, there was contempt. In business dealings, arrogance. When looking at anyone, a silent judgment heavier than words. He seemed to feed off the feeling of being feared, of knowing that everyone around him needed to bow before him. And yet, there were fleeting moments when his gaze drifted into emptiness, revealing a weary man, a tormented heart he never allowed to surface. It was as if his entire life had been built upon unresolved grudges and wounds that never healed. One night, during a private dinner, the young woman dared to ask why he always seemed so full of anger. The millionaire laughed, but it was not laughter of joy. It was a bitter laugh, laden with irony. He said the world was no place for the weak, that only those who learned to crush others survived, and that he had become who he was because once he had been deceived, betrayed, and humiliated. He spoke of loves that had never worked out, of family members who abandoned him because of money, of friends who revealed themselves to be false. Each word was a fragment of his soul exposed, but the way he spoke made it clear. Instead of overcoming pain, he had fed on it. transforming it into a shield against any true feeling. The young woman, with tears restrained in her eyes, realized that behind that sculpted body and virile face hid a heart covered in scars. A heart that had chosen to shut itself off from love, preferring proud solitude to the vulnerability of trusting someone. And in that instant, she understood that he was not cruel simply by nature, but because life had made him so. It did not justify his wickedness, but it explained why he was incapable of giving or receiving affection. The discovery was painful, but it also awakened in her an unexpected compassion. For the first time, she did not see him merely as the man who had bought her virginity, but as someone carrying invisible wounds. She felt afraid of getting too close, but also a strange desire to touch that hardened heart, to show him there was still a chance for redemption. She knew it would be an arduous path, full of humiliations and tears, but something within her told her that if she endured, she could transform not only her own life, but his as well. And so, amid suffocating luxury and heavy silences, the young woman discovered the millionaire's hard heart. A heart proud, resentful, and cruel, but that, despite all its layers of stone, still beat, hiding, perhaps, the hope that even he no longer believed could exist. That morning, the millionaire seemed more irritable than usual. He had argued with a business partner during a meeting and unleashed his fury on everyone in the mansion. Orders were shouted, the servants trembled with fear, and the entire atmosphere seemed to pulse with the heavy energy of his arrogance. The young woman, silent, only observed, keeping herself in the corner, not wanting to attract his wrath. But at a certain moment, a glass slipped from her hands and shattered into pieces on the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone knew that it would not go unpunished. He approached slowly with a frozen stare, and the entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. But something unexpected happened. When he saw her crouched, holding the shards with her delicate hands that had been cut in the process, he did not find resistance or defiance. He found only a pair of tearful eyes, full of innocence and fear, but also of silent courage. She did not beg, did not cry in despair, did not theatrically ask for forgiveness. She simply lifted her eyes to him and said, with a soft voice, that she would take responsibility for the consequences, but she would not run away. That attitude, so different from the flattery and submissiveness he was accustomed to, disarmed him completely. For an instant, the wall of pride surrounding him began to crack. He took a deep breath, as if fighting something inside himself, and instead of exploding in shouts as everyone expected, he simply held her hand to remove the shards of glass. It was the first time he touched her without domination, without imposition. His strong fingers enveloped hers, and as he saw the blood trickling from the small wounds, a strange sensation coursed through his chest. For the first time in a very long while, he felt something that was not arrogance or power. It was concern. The young woman was surprised. She expected fury, contempt, but instead found an almost human, almost tender gesture. He cleaned the cuts clumsily, murmuring harsh words to disguise the tenderness that escaped. He said she should be more careful, that he had no time to deal with weaknesses, but his voice did not carry the same coldness as always. There was a trace of fragility there, a reflection of humanity he tried so hard to hide. It was in that instant she realized, behind all the cruelty, there was a broken man, someone who had hardened himself to survive, but who deep down was still capable of feeling. The crack was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The hardened heart he always hid was beginning to fracture in the face of her purity and courage. That night, when the young woman returned to her room, she carried with her a strange sensation. She still suffered. She was still trapped in a cruel contract. She still bore the weight of humiliation. But now she had seen a different spark, a glimpse that this man was not only made of resentment. Perhaps, she thought, it was possible to awaken in him something greater, something even he no longer believed existed. And for the first time, the millionaire also lost sleep. Lying in his bed, he remembered her eyes, the courage she showed in facing his wrath without pleading, and the delicacy of her small hands wounded because of a simple broken glass. He did not understand why it disturbed him so much, but he knew something inside him was changing. The first crack had appeared, and no matter how hard he tried, he would not be able to ignore it. The news spread like wildfire. In ballrooms, within the circles of the elite, and in discreet newspaper columns fed by rumors, the truth was whispered in poisonous tones. The millionaire had bought the virginity of a poor girl. For some, it was nothing more than another eccentricity of a man used to owning everything. For others, it was an unforgivable offense, a scandal that exposed the rottenness of his soul. His name, once surrounded by respect and fear, was now entangled with malice and morbid curiosity. And, as always, the one who suffered the most was her. The young woman, who had sought nothing more than to save her sick father, became the target of cruel stares and cutting words. Wherever she went, she felt judgment hanging in the air. Wealthy women despised her, calling her an opportunist, a gold digger, someone who had sold her body for easy money. Men whispered mockingly, reducing her pain to a spectacle. Even simple people, who knew nothing of her struggle, repeated the lies as if they were truths. It was as if the whole world had decided to turn her into a villain, when, in reality, she was just a desperate daughter who had sacrificed her own innocence out of love. The millionaire, instead of protecting her, reinforced his arrogance even more. In interviews and public appearances, he denied nothing. On the contrary, he smiled with disdain and made it clear that he did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, because no one had the power to judge him. His pride spoke louder than any prudence, and he seemed to revel in provoking even greater scandal. For him, it was a victory against the hypocrisy of a society that had always envied him. But at the same time, it was a price paid by her, who had no defenses against such cruelty. At the mansion, the young woman cried silently, hidden in her chambers. She felt the weight of humiliation crushing her soul, as if every word spoken outside was a stone thrown at her heart. And yet, she remained strong. Her father, back home, was beginning to show signs of improvement thanks to the treatment paid for with that money. And that was what sustained her. Every swallowed tear, every invisible wound, every insult she bore without defending herself was for him, for the man who had taught her the value of family, kindness, and courage. But the millionaire's pride also began to exact its toll. He realized that the more he flaunted himself, the more isolated he became. Business partners distanced themselves, deals began to suffer, and even those who once bowed to his fortune now looked at him with suspicion. For the first time in many years, the world was not just revering him, the world was judging him. And though he would never admit it, this change unsettled him. What had once been mere amusement was now also a burden. The young woman, observing him, noticed this discomfort hidden in his eyes. Behind the mask of pride, there was a man beginning to feel the weight of his choices. And though he never said it out loud, she knew. The scandal had not only stained his name, it had also left a scar on his heart. It was the price of pride, a price both of them paid in different ways. She, with tears and humiliations. He, with the suffocating solitude that grew heavier with each passing day. But even amid the sea of pain and judgment, a silent flame continued to burn between them, growing each day, fueled by the clash between her innocence and his arrogance. A flame that sooner or later would be impossible to extinguish. The weeks that followed were marked by a silence heavier than any cruel word. The young woman lived inside the mansion like a shadow, walking through corridors of luxury where she did not feel she belonged, enduring the scornful looks of the servants and the invisible judgment of a society that still branded her an opportunist. But her pain was not only external. Within her, a storm consumed her. She suffered at the thought that her innocence had been turned into currency. She suffered realizing that her life was now controlled by a proud man who did not know how to love. She suffered under the weight of the secret she could never reveal to her parents. Even so, there was a silent strength within her that kept her standing. Whenever she closed her eyes, she remembered her father smiling through his coughs, thanking her for the treatment that was beginning to show small signs of improvement. It was for him that she endured everything. It was for his life that she accepted humiliation, swallowed her tears in secret, and walked with dignity, even when her soul begged for rest. The suffering was immense, but still she resisted, with the poise of someone who knew that her pain was buying hope for the one she loved most. The millionaire, in turn, continued to maintain the posture of a hard and impenetrable man. Yet, more and more, he found himself disturbed by the way that young woman endured everything in silence. He was used to women who sold themselves for jewels, for parties, for trips, but she was different. She never asked for anything, never complained, never begged. She simply remained firm, even in the midst of the storm. And that confused him, because it challenged everything he thought he knew about love and about life. There were nights when he secretly watched her. He saw her cry alone in her room, burying her face in the pillow so that no one would notice. He felt something strange in his chest, something he could not name. Remorse, perhaps, or a deep discomfort, as if his cruelty no longer gave him pleasure but pain. He tried to push these feelings away, reminding himself of the betrayals and wounds that had turned him into stone. But he could not deny the truth. That young woman was beginning to break his defenses, not with screams, but with silence. Her suffering became, little by little, his suffering. He would not admit it, would not say it out loud, but he carried within himself the weight of realizing that he had destroyed something pure, and that, even so, that purity still endured. With every delicate gesture, every silent glance, every hidden tear, he felt the wall of his pride crumble even more, and that terrified him, because it meant he was becoming vulnerable. The young woman, without knowing it, was beginning to awaken in him the spark of humanity he had buried decades ago. Her silent suffering, far from weakening her, made her stronger, and that strength, born from pain, was already beginning to touch the hardened heart of a man who believed himself incapable of ever feeling again. The millionaire had always been proud of his own strength. He liked to display his muscular body, to show that, even at 60 years old, he was more vigorous than many younger men. His vanity was reflected in his daily workouts, in the way he walked shirtless through the mansion, as if he were immortal. But the body, no matter how strong it seemed, could not hide the truth that was beginning to reveal itself in silence. His heart was no longer as invincible as he believed. It all began with small twinges in his chest, quick, almost insignificant. Then came the unexpected fatigue, the shortness of breath after arguments, the racing heartbeat in moments of anger. He ignored every symptom, convinced that nothing could defeat him. Too proud to admit weakness, he never went to doctors, never told anyone. But in the lonely nights, lying in his bed, he felt his body betray him. The heart, the very same heart that seemed incapable of loving, now showed signs that it too carried invisible wounds. The young woman noticed before anyone else. Attentive to details, she saw when he discreetly pressed a hand to his chest, when he took deep breaths to hide it, when his face lost its color for a few moments. She tried to ask, but received only harsh answers, accompanied by looks that told her to be silent. He would never admit, not ever, that he was sick. His pride was greater than his own health. In silence, she began to watch him with growing concern. She saw in him not only the cruel and arrogant man who humiliated her, but also a fragile human being, hostage to a tired heart. Every gesture of hers, no matter how discreet, offering him water, asking him to rest, adjusting the chair so he could breathe better, stirred in him a strange anger, as if being treated with care were unbearable, and yet he could never fully reject it. The illness growing inside him was not only physical, it was also the reflection of an entire life lived in rancor, pride, and solitude. The heart, hardened by hatred and vanity, was now demanding its price, and though he tried to deny it, he knew he could not fight against it alone. In that mansion full of luxury, where everything seemed eternal, the millionaire began to realize his own mortality. It was not only his body that betrayed him, but also life itself, showing him that no power, no wealth, no contract could stop the truth. The man who had always believed himself invincible was discovering, little by little, that he was as vulnerable as anyone else. And paradoxically, it was precisely the young woman he had bought, humiliated, and tried to control who had become the only one capable of seeing the pain hidden in his chest. It was the disease of pride, a sickness that not only weakened his body, but also forced him to face what he had always tried to escape, the loneliness of a heart that had never truly learned how to love. The night fell heavy over the mansion. Silence reigned, But inside the millionaire's room, the only sound echoing was that of his own desperate heart. He awoke with a sharp pain in his chest, a pressure that stole his breath away. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him, and the muscular body he once displayed with pride now bent under its own fragility. For the first time in years, he felt the fear of death, the fear of being defeated by something money could never buy: health and time. The young woman, asleep in her room, was startled by a dull noise from the upper floor. Running down the hallway, she found the millionaire collapsed beside his bed, gasping, his face contorted with pain. Without hesitation, she knelt at his side and held his trembling hand. She called out his name, begged him to hold on, while frantically dialing for emergency services. The man who had always seemed invincible now depended entirely on her to survive. In the moments before the doctors arrived, she stayed with him, cradling his head in her lap, whispering words of strength. He looked at her with tear-filled eyes, as if he couldn't believe someone would care for him without asking for anything in return. Amid the pain, he muttered fragmented words, childhood memories, names long forgotten. His mask of arrogance had fallen completely. In that moment, he was no longer the proud millionaire, no longer the cruel man everyone feared. He was simply a fragile human being, facing the weight of his own loneliness. The hospital became the stage of his transformation. The young woman never left his side. She spent days there, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, fixing his sheets, offering water, holding his hand through the worst moments. There was no luxury there, no contracts, no masks, only her, caring for him in a way no one ever had. And for the first time, he felt what it meant to be loved unconditionally, without interests, without bargains. The millionaire, used to being served, discovered the value of tenderness. His once cold eyes now sought hers with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. How could someone he had bought, humiliated and despised, still remain by his side? How could this young girl, so pure, offer more than anyone else had in his entire life? The pride that had sustained him for decades began to crumble before the silent strength of this young woman who, without realizing it, had already become essential to his existence. And there, in that hospital bed, he faced his greatest trial. It was not only about fighting the pain in his chest, but about confronting the love that was being born inside him against his will. For the first time, he silently admitted that he was not invincible, that he needed her, that perhaps he had always needed her. The young woman, with her delicacy and courage, had shown him what true love meant, and, unknowingly, she had planted the seed that would forever transform the hardened heart of a man who had grown accustomed to living alone. The millionaire returned from his hospitalization quieter than ever. His steps were still firm, but they no longer carried the arrogance they once did. His muscular body, though still imposing, now seemed more vulnerable, as if every fiber carried the memory of the pain that had brought him down. For the first time in decades, he faced the fragility of his own life and realized there was no fortune, no contracts, no luxuries capable of buying time. And amidst that bitter discovery, there was also the constant memory of the young woman who had remained at his side, unwavering, even when everyone would have believed she would run away. The transformation began with small gestures. He no longer yelled so much at the servants, no longer imposed his presence like a crushing shadow. Little by little, he began to look around and notice details he had always ignored. He observed how the young woman cared for the flowers in the garden, how she smiled discreetly when she received news of her father's recovery, how she walked through the mansion with dignity even after so many humiliations. He, who had always believed everyone was driven by self-interest, now saw the purity of a woman who sought nothing more than to save her family and endure in silence. One morning, he surprised everyone by walking into the dining room and thanking the cook for the breakfast served. The gesture, simple for anyone else, seemed impossible coming from him. The employees looked at one another in shock, and the young woman, who witnessed the scene, felt her heart race. It was as if that man, who once didn't even know the word gratitude, was finally learning to see people as human beings and not as disposable pieces. With her, the changes were even more profound. He no longer treated her as property, no longer displayed her as a trophy. He began to listen to her, even if silently, paying attention to every word she said. From time to time, he risked a less harsh comment, and, on rare occasions, Even a timid smile escaped his lips. The young woman noticed that his hardened heart, layered with resentment and pride, was beginning to soften before something he had never allowed: true love. But the process was not easy. There were days when his old pride returned with strength, when he locked himself in his office and tried to wear once again the mask of coldness. Yet he was no longer the same. The image of the young woman holding his hand in the hospital, her silent tears, her courage to remain when everything seemed lost, haunted him in both a sweet and painful way. No matter how hard he tried, he could no longer ignore that there was something in her that transformed him from the inside out. It was then that he realized something he had never admitted. All the money, all the strength, all the luxury he possessed had never made him happy. His life, marked by conquests and arrogance, had always been empty. And now, before a young woman who had sold her purity out of desperation, he discovered what it meant to be loved without conditions, to be cared for without interests, to be seen as a man and not as an untouchable idol. The transformation was not his alone, but hers as well. The young woman, who at first saw only a tormentor in him, began to see the wounded man that existed behind the armor. She began to notice the tenderness hidden in small gestures, the fragility disguised in glances, the longing for a life he had never lived. Love, once impossible, now appeared as a timid but real flame, capable of warming even the coldest heart. And so, the man everyone had known as proud and cruel took his first steps toward redemption, guided not by the power of money, but by the purity of a girl who transformed his life with the simple power of loving without asking anything in return. The news fell like lightning upon the world of the elite. The millionaire, known for his coldness and arrogance, had proposed marriage to the poor young woman everyone believed was nothing more than a fleeting adventure. It was not an announcement made at grand parties or amidst clinking champagne glasses. It was an unexpected, intimate proposal, born from the transformation he had undergone. On a calm night, in the moonlit garden, the man who had once bought her as if she were a commodity knelt down, his voice trembling, and confessed that he wanted to join his life with hers, not by contract, not by pride, but by love. The young woman, upon hearing those words, felt tears stream down her face. For so long, she had endured humiliation, prejudice, and pain, but now the weight began to dissolve into a new emotion. The man who had once treated her with contempt now looked at her with sincerity, with teary eyes that revealed not only fragility, but also regret. It was as if, finally, he had learned that love cannot be bought, only won. The wedding, however, was marked by resistance. Society condemned it, mocking the age difference, the dark past that bound them, the humiliations everyone knew she had endured. His family opposed it, distant friends criticized it, and gossip columns published malicious texts. But despite the storm of judgment, the millionaire did not back down. For the first time, he did not use pride as a shield, but love as his weapon. He faced the comments with firmness, making it clear that he was determined to build a life with her, regardless of the world's opinion. On the day of the ceremony, few believed it would be real. The church, adorned with white flowers, witnessed a moment no one expected. The imposing man of 60, dressed in an impeccable suit, walked to the altar not as a proud conqueror, but as someone who had finally surrendered to the feeling he had always denied. At his side, the 18-year-old young woman, wearing a simple yet radiant dress of purity, carried in her eyes the strength of someone who had transformed pain into hope. When they exchanged vows, no luxury could compare to the intensity of that moment. He, with a trembling voice, confessed that he had learned to love through her, that his life had only gained meaning when he discovered her courage and kindness. She, with tears glistening in her eyes, declared that despite everything, she had found in his heart a home she had never imagined could exist. The words were simple, but carried the truth that everyone there tried to deny. Love, as improbable as it seemed, had triumphed. As the bells rang, announcing the union so many had doubted, the two embraced tightly, as if sealing not only a marriage but a victory against a cruel destiny. The man who had once bought her innocence now offered his entire life, and the young woman who had once sold her purity out of despair now gave her heart by choice. The improbable wedding was not just a social event, but proof that even the most condemned loves can flourish when nourished by the power of transformation. He, marked by pride and loneliness, found redemption. She, marked by sacrifice, found fulfillment. And together, they showed that true love respects no conventions, bends to no prejudice, and is not measured by age or circumstance. It simply happens. The mansion that had once been the stage of silence and arrogance now breathed new life. The walls, which had witnessed shouts and humiliations, now heard soft laughter, warm conversations, and footsteps that no longer echoed in solitude. The millionaire, transformed by the love he once deemed impossible, left behind the proud and cruel man he had been. He was no longer the feared master who treated people like objects, but someone who had finally learned the value of simple gestures, thanking a servant, smiling at the sight of his wife in the garden, offering his arm to walk tenderly at her side. The young woman, who had entered his life as a prisoner of fate, was now his true companion. There were no more contracts, no more conditions, no more humiliations. There was only love. She walked through the mansion with dignity, no longer as an intruder, but as the lady of the house, carrying within her the light that had illuminated even the darkest corners of his soul. Her eyes, still so young, shone with a maturity earned through pain, but also with the hope of an entire life ahead. Her parents, still humble, were received with honor. The millionaire, who once would never have opened the doors of his house to anyone outside his elite, now cared for them as if they were part of his own family. Her father, recovering thanks to the treatment paid for with the money that once felt tainted, now smiled as he watched his daughter happy. Her mother, deeply moved, embraced her daughter with tears of relief, proud of the strength she had shown in facing the impossible. The society that had mocked and criticized them so harshly had no choice but to remain silent before the force of the bond that united them. What had seemed like a scandal turned into an example of resilience, and although many still whispered behind their backs, nothing else mattered. Love had triumphed over arrogance, prejudice, the cruel contract, and even the difference in age. On a golden afternoon, he walked through the garden with her by his side. His gaze was no longer cold and distant. Now his eyes sought hers with gratitude and tenderness. He held her hand firmly and confessed in a low voice that he had never imagined being able to truly love someone. She smiled, and in that smile lay the answer to all the pain they had endured. Love had not only united them, but had also healed them. The man who had begun as a cruel and proud millionaire had redeemed himself, and the young woman, who had sacrificed her purity to save her father's life, found in the end not a prison, but the freedom of living beside someone who truly loved her. The ending, which many expected to be tragic, became one of redemption. It was not merely an improbable marriage. It was living proof that true love has the power to transform even the hardest heart, revealing that happiness can bloom where least expected.